Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. And I'm also welcoming back Damon Baker. He was a guest recently, episode 454, back on August 17th. He is, again, the founder and CEO of the firm Lean Focus, and he's also a private equity partner at Coltala Holdings. I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that episode. It was a great discussion. You can find that at leanblog.org/454 or scroll, I guess it would be down in your podcast feed, wherever you're listening to this. Again, look for episode 454. And Damon's website and the Lean Focus website, again, is leanfocus.com. So Damon, thank you for coming back on for a little extra bonus conversation. How are you?
I'm doing well, Mark. Thanks for having me, and I will try not to wear out my welcome by doing this too many times in a row for you. So appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, not at all. We had so much to talk about last time. We didn't get to a couple of topics that I wanted to ask you about. That's not your fault. We had great discussion, but we're going to focus today on private equity and something called the Ownership Works Initiative. So those are the things we're going to cover here. Damon's really well positioned to help educate us about this and connections to Lean. And so maybe first off, Damon, I'm guessing, or there may very well be a lot of people in the audience who've maybe heard the phrase private equity, but don't really understand what that means as an ownership model. So if you wouldn't mind, give us a little bit of private equity 101.
Sure. So, the differentiating model between a publicly held corporation and a privately held corporation and a private equity held corporation, I'll try to spell out the difference. So I think we're probably all most familiar with how a public corporation works. You and I can go to Fidelity and we can make an investment into our individual stock accounts, or perhaps we have, as part of a 401k or an IRA, we invest in these public companies like Apple and Google and others, and that one's pretty straightforward. If you own a lot of stock in those corporations, like a Warren Buffett, then you have a material vote in the say and strategy of the company, and in some point you can own so much of the company that you can be an activist investor and you can actually shape who's on the board and, again, the makeup of the company and those kinds of things. So that's kind of publicly held corporation. And then the privately held founder-led business, Mark's one, I'm one, some equity arrangement, either it's 100% owned by the founder or some equity allocation amongst the individual, usually our employees or advisors or something like that. And then there's private equity. So private equity is a situation, so really just two types of private equity at the beginning. So there's a private equity firm that has a fund, which means that they solicit investment monies from their network, which are usually high net worth individuals that are interested in investing in investment opportunities that maybe aren't available to the public. And they basically say, for this particular fund that we're raising, here's the amount of funds we need in order to secure the investment to acquire the businesses that we'd like to acquire. And the monies in that fund will be tied up for a period of time, which is predetermined by the fund. And it could be anywhere between 3 to 7 years, which is pretty typical, where those funds then exit and then a new fund is initiated. So that's one type of private equity. Then the other type of private equity which is the type that I'm affiliated with as well, is we don't raise a fund. Each acquisition is a standalone investment that we have to fund the funds for separately. And usually the way these investments are funded is through debt and equity, right? So they reach out to again, high net worth individuals or your friends and family, your network, whomever, and we need to raise a certain amount of the equity for the purchase of the company. And then the remainder of the investment to buy the company is funded through debt. And there could be different types of debt, subordinated debt and mezzanine debt and so on and so forth. But so usually a combination in debt and equity is what's used to fund an acquisition in private equity. And, going back to the old 1980s, Drexel, Burnham, and Lambert bonds, that kind of stuff. There was, and even Danaher, where I came from, was a leveraged acquisition.
Yeah, there was the term leveraged buyout.
Yeah, exactly.
Common, right?
Yeah. So they're using debt to fund the acquisition of these businesses, oftentimes aggressively, without the willing participation in the people who are owning the company at the moment.
So that's not, becomes like a hostile takeover.
Yeah, and that's not what we do, and not what most private equity does either. They look for willing participants in the sale process, right? So then the two types, there's a fund and then there's individual investment that you can hold these companies as long as you want, but private equity generally doesn't make money unless they exit these acquisitions at some point in the future. And hopefully when they exit them at a higher valuation, or multiples of EBITDA is the terminology that's used in private equity, higher than what they acquired the business for. So you may acquire a business at 3x earnings and then turn around 7 years from now and sell it at 10x earnings, and you just made a return on your investment. So, and then there's all flavors of size of private equity. So on the high end, you've got the KKRs and the Blackstones of the world. And then as you move down the spectrum, in what we would call like the lower middle market would probably be the opposite end of the spectrum, where the earnings of the businesses there would probably be in the 5 to 20 million of EBITDA range, whereas a KKR or a Blackstone would buy companies that have hundreds of millions of dollars of EBITDA as part of the person. They're going to be competing with the likes of publicly traded corporations for those acquisitions as well, right? And usually they're not very secret when they become for sale. They usually go out to an auction type of process where they're using an investment banking firm like Goldman Sachs or others to broker the sale of the business. Whereas usually on the lower middle market side, a lot of the times you can get really good deals by just your network and people that who are ready to sell at this point in their journey. And those are called off-market acquisitions, which is a lot of what we've done at Coltala pretty successfully.
So to that first type of firm that you talk about, where they have a certain window, the fund is done, does that force the private equity company to sell the companies they're holding at the end of that time frame?
Yeah, so they exit those companies at that fund. So there's this productive tension that exists. Like day one, you're already thinking about the things you need to do to sell the business day one, because there's a predetermined time horizon that you need to exit the ownership of these businesses. So the value creation roadmap or the lean roadmap, whatever terminology you want to use, needs to be very precise and surgical about what levers you need to focus on, and maybe less about the cultural aspects and the whole integrated business system approach, and more about how do we just move the needle on this particular investment. So there's a different appetite for a lean business system in the private equity world than there is in a publicly traded corporation that has a longer horizon.
And when you talk about a value creation model, that second type of firm, including Coltala Holdings, it sounds like you don't have an arbitrary time frame. You can hold, you can improve the company, create value, hold it as long as it makes sense to hold, instead of having kind of an arbitrary ticking clock. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's very accurate. The one thing you are running up against is the investors at some point want to get paid, and typically in these situations there isn't any sort of earnings that are distributed to the investors during the holding period. So your money is tied up for whatever period of time that you own the business. So if you hold this thing for 10 years, then it's basically like you have your investment tied up for 10 years. Right. So you may get antsy at some point to say, well, guys, I don't have forever on the planet. I'd like to get some sort of return on my money. So it's not infinite, and it's not, defined by the arbitrary, time horizons of a fund per se. But, I'd say pretty typical, like anything beyond 7 years is like, that's a long time to own a business in the private equity world.
So it sounds like, there's different dynamics where, well, first, let me ground this and talk about, principles of the Toyota way, going back to Jeff Liker's book. Principle one, and I think it's probably first in that list for a reason, talks about making decisions with a long-term focus. Now, what do we mean by long-term? That could mean different things to different people. Making business decisions for the long term, even at the expense of the short term. So public companies often have this dynamic of, we got to hit the quarter's numbers, and there's criticism of, boy, there's a short-term focus. There's all kinds of dumb things a public company can do to make the numbers look good now that might damage things for the future. Private equity, it seems like the best of that might be a mid or long-term focus. How would you compare some of those pressures? Is it that, what's your reaction to that comparison?
Yeah, I think the intensity level in private equity is far greater in terms of what have you done for me lately type of discussion in terms of the results. And there's a natural selection process in terms of prioritization that you automatically say no to things that don't fit the value creation roadmap by design, which is good because you don't have a lot of those conversations that you might have in a company that's a publicly traded company, that you find yourself distracted with initiatives that are all well intended but don't move the needle in a short amount of time. So I like that aspect of it. But there's trade-offs to everything. It's like, if you're so focused on the outcomes, then maybe you miss the importance on people and culture and the sustainability of the organization at exit when you go to sell this business, and your impact on society and your impact in the community. All those things are noble pursuits, and things that, any publicly traded company right now is being pressured to do by investors and shareholders. Whereas in the private equity world, there's less of a appetite for and less of a pull for, because of just what the investors' expectations are. It's different. I want to get my money out quick and make a return.
Yeah.
But there, however, and it kind of goes in the ownership works topic that we'll talk about later, is there is a rising sort of movement in private equity where it's mission over margin, if you will. And there's also another term coined called conscious capitalism. So, let's not just try to wring as much value out of each one of these acquisitions as possible to bleed them dry, and keep this thing together with duct tape long enough to sell it and make money, and then have it all fall apart when we run to the bank. I think people have wisened up to that, especially the buyers. Like they're more adept at spotting when that's gone on, and I think there's less of an opportunity in the private equity space as there was 10 or 15 years ago to get value creation just out of funny math, financial arbitrage, putting debt on the company, doing short-term sort of stuff, which is going to hurt the business long term. I think there's the buyers are more intelligent to spot that kind of stuff. So it is naturally forced private equity to care more about things now than they have in the past to make it more sustainable, including Coltala Holdings, where I'm a part of.
And when you say the buyers, do you mean the investors in the funds? There were the investors in the acquisitions?
No, I mean the next owner of the business.
Oh, after private equity.
Yeah, exactly. So whomever, it could be another private equity firm that buys it from the previous private equity firm, or it could be a publicly traded company, or somebody could get funds together and take the whole thing.
Gotcha.
Private and not have. So
yeah, because on that exit. Okay, so what I hear you saying, this makes sense. People, the next buyer of the company is trying to make sure they're not buying something that's a shell of its former self. Like, there's, again, I think this is that first model that you were describing of private equity coming in, like, some of the major retailers, like, I think Toys R Us was an example of, like, maybe it was a business that was facing pressure from Amazon and online purchases. But my layman's reading of some business press articles is that they were acquired by private equity, loaded up with debt, lots of money being extracted, and then it kind of collapses, and people blame private equity. But it sounds like we shouldn't paint with too broad of a brush, as you've laid out. Not all private equity companies operate the same way.
No, and all those scenarios that you just detailed, you could probably find a similar scenario in a publicly traded company where a slash and burn CEO comes in and his or her incentives are financially tied to EBITDA or margin expansion. Anybody remember Sunbeam and Al Dunlap?
Chainsaw Al. He was a disciple of Jack Welch. Yeah.
So you can have it in that world too. So I think again, people are savvy buyers. They know when the car is being held together by duct tape, and there's Bondo in the door panel. It's the accident that happened.
Right. So how does lean tie in then to this value creation model? Like how does Coltala Holdings, how do you use lean with the companies you've acquired to create value, to improve the business, to position it for a better sale?
So my first real introduction into the private equity world was in 2005, working for a turnaround consulting firm called Argo Consulting. And private equity, again, here's the different flavors of private equity. Some private equity firms have an internal operations improvement group. Kind of think of it like a Danaher business system office or a Toyota production system office. And they're chartered with working with these businesses that they buy to improve them. And sometimes, depending on their size, they may not be able to afford that. So they outsource it to consulting firms, and that's what Argo did. So we worked with firms like AEA, which is a rather large PE firm, kind of along the spectrum, closer to the KKR model and the Blackstone model. And they were very interested in value creation as it related to operations improvement. So they've already narrowly defined value creation, at least partnering with a firm like ours as being in the operations realm only, the four walls of a factory, and then extend that to supply chain. So we go in and we do a lot of what you would expect, doing Kaizen to improve labor utilization, which meant a lot of times Kaizen to cut heads, which, looking back on, I wasn't always proud with how that was handled. But again, it's private equity. It's like, there wasn't a good sort of policy and sort of cultural stance internally around what do we do with people that are displaced through this improvement activity, which made my job and our job even harder to convince people that Kaizen was a good thing. Right. So then you are plugging into what PE refers to as a value creation plan. So we have like a swim lane where it's operations, labor arbitrage, inventory improvements, quality improvement, warranty expense, and go down the items of the P&L as it relates to the operations responsibility. And we would be helping to accelerate all of those gains that were identified during diligence as an opportunity, and making those opportunities uncovered during diligence a reality so that they're bankable, so that at exit, those are now things that we can count on as savings in the business or cash flow improvements in the business. So did that for 2 years, and then got to Danaher and did push pause on the private equity involvement, other than when Danaher was trying to buy businesses, they would oftentimes run up against other PE firms bidding for the same companies. So then after Danaher, I got involved with this Coltala group. So the way it works in our group is our lean focused team and myself are the portfolio operations improvement people. And we are involved in the entire life cycle, from diligence to creating the value creation plan to post-acquisition integration and value creation activities, and all the way up to exit. But we haven't exited yet, so we've aren't there, so we don't know what that will look like yet. So we identify during diligence what the value creation opportunities are, and they generally fall into three high-level buckets: growth-related activities that are going to drive organic growth and even inorganic, so acquisitions that you can make. Then profit or margin expansion opportunities, EBITDA, and then the third leg would be working capital or cash flow improvement types of opportunities. And all of those opportunities are going to map back to tools or approaches that need to be leveraged inside the business system in order to make those things real.
Right.
And so lots of Kaizen events have to happen, lots of projects and so on. But then there's also just capabilities that need to be installed in the business in order for the business just to continually improve over time. Strategy deployment needs to be installed as a process and a discipline. Daily management needs to be installed as a process and a discipline in all the affected departments, not only just the four walls of the factory. So you're teaching the organization oftentimes a new way of running their business that's foreign to them. Not that they haven't solved problems, of course they have, but
Sure.
Introducing like structured problem solving and metrics and putting together an action plan to close a gap, it's like calculus sometimes to people.
Yeah.
So then we provide the support, we train in the tool, we facilitate, we push, we challenge, we set high expectations, but ultimately we're trying to affect a business result and then make that change real so that the P&L reflects the process improvement made.
Yeah.
And in parallel, you've hopefully changed somebody's thinking along the way, and you're teaching them how to lead their business in a way that would be congruent with how a lean leader would behave inside of a lean culture.
Yeah.
Does it always happen to your desired level of satisfaction? No. And I think in the PE space, you sort of have to pick your battles too, where maybe in a Danaher, you have this top-down organization saying thou shalt do all of these things and they're non-negotiable. As in the PE world, you're working with a founder who's reinvested into the business and is critical to make the strategy go. You have to sort of pick your battles and which thing you disagree with, because you're riding that horse to the finish line 5 to 7 years down the line.
Yeah. So is there a decision point for the PE firm of acquiring a company? Are you acquiring 100% equity? Are you leaving a founder in place who still has some equity, where you're trying to find alignment and growth and improvement together? How often does that person say, hey, that's my exit? I've built this, it's time for me to retire, I'm going to sell it. How often do those things happen?
Yeah, I mean, that is a really important part of the criteria of the types of businesses we target too. So when you go into the situation, you don't know what the ownership situation is on the ground when you initiate contact with the potential acquisition. So let's say it's a founder-led business. He or she has grown this business over time. They've got their thumbprints on everything. They are the business in effect, if you will. And they are at a situation in their life, and usually it's like they want to preserve their legacy. So they'll say things like, I want the culture to be intact. I don't want people to be let go. So they have a lot of requirements in order to sell, and they want to hear from the PE firm that they're going to honor those things.
Yeah.
But they themselves are wanting to take chips off the table, meaning they want to sell their business and live a different life than they've led for the prior decades, where they've done nothing but work their ass off to get where they are. And that's a noble outcome. And a lot of founders choose that path. We as a PE firm, if we're buying a business and want to continue that relationship with somebody, it's great to have a founder that wants to reinvest. And we call it taking another bite at the apple. So they get paid for the valuation of their business up until this point, and then they're invited to stay on. And oftentimes they just remain the CEO, and they're reinvesting a significant piece of equity, called rolling over equity, into the new entity. So they have a significant enough share that their interests are aligned with the PE firm. So they want to embrace this lean business system thinking, this value creation roadmap, because the exit multiple they're going to get 5 to 7 years down the line is nothing compared to, this one they got now is nothing compared to the one 5 to 7 years from now that could be. And we're talking about generational wealth at that point.
Yeah.
And that's the carrot that keeps the founder. And we like that second situation better than the first one.
Sure.
And there's a third situation which we've done and haven't been too successful with. And we just sort of problem solved this yesterday, actually, kind of postmortem, is that founder takes the money off the table, and then you think you can bring in a leadership team from the outside that's going to take this business to a new place. Just imagine all the cultural challenges you're going to face. It's like outside team comes in, we know this industry inside and out. Well, the employees that remain are probably aligned to the prior leadership, and then there's this sort of internal fractions that develop that you have to be mindful of. And at the end of the day, it's like processes don't have feelings, people do, and you got to navigate people through that change management process. And I think in private equity, oftentimes that gets discounted as being a real thing when it's an absolutely real thing. And it's the cause for why change doesn't happen.
Yeah. And so, for anyone who goes and looks at the Coltala Holdings website, it's just coltala.com. I'll link to it in the show notes. You see Damon on the team listed as a managing director / Coltala Enterprise System. So it sounds like that's your domain. That's your baby, if you will, to define, develop that kind of, again, thinking back to the other episode where you talked about how important it is to have your business system. It sounds like Coltala, you've developed that based on your past influences. And how is that different, do you think, in a private equity kind of model?
Yeah, I think you have to be mindful that each one of these businesses that you are acquiring is different. So at a high level, it's like, does this company make something, or are they a service business? So that's kind of like the first decision tree. And by by the answer to that question, it dictates which tools in CES apply or not. So, do we really need to talk about setup reduction in a manufacturing context when we're talking about a service-oriented business that does heating, ventilation, air conditioning, as an example, right? So differentiating. So there's a menu of tools available as the Coltala Enterprise System, but we're very thoughtful in which tools we apply in which business based on the nature of the business and maturity wise and priority wise, what we need to work on right now in order to affect the value creation needed in year 1, year 2, year 3. So it's less of we need to do all these things well, maybe kind of like sometimes in a corporate world where there's a business system, like we have to do it all well and none of it sort of be half-hearted. You're more precise and surgical about it in PE context.
Yeah, so you mentioned different tools, but then, even a couple of minutes ago, you talked about within Coltala, as you said, we problem solved that. It sounds like a lot of this is problem solving the business at a high level, right? Is it a revenue and growth challenge? Is it a cost opportunity, quality, customer service? Just to look at like, what are the barriers? What are the causes of that business not being as successful as you think it could be?
Yeah, for sure. So you think about Coltala as a holding company, they make or sell nothing. And one could argue that they're non-value added. They probably wouldn't like that, but so the way private equity works is they get a management fee, and that's it's not significant. You're not going to retire off a management fee. You retire off of the exit value of selling it. So when I joined these guys, they had a thirst for understanding how to use a lean business system to drive value creation in the private equity space. And the reason they had this appetite is they had 20 years of PE experience, and they've watched sort of an evolution happen in the industry where just hundreds, thousands of new PE firms cropping up. Access to capital is not the problem in private equity. There's a lot of money out there waiting to be invested, sitting on the sidelines. But what they learned, which led them to this idea that CES is meaningful, is that they couldn't control the outcome. Meaning the results that they got at exit were a function of really the leadership teams that they were buying. or the lack of leadership teams that they were buying. So you had some really good ones at exit, some really crappy ones, and on average, you hope that you had a better return than the stock market, which,
Right.
looking back the last 20 years, one could make a case and say, would we have been better served investing in Apple or Danaher stock, Google stock, right? Did we really, for all that work that we did, was it worthwhile? So they want to get out in front of that and say, look, there are companies out there who have a repeatable business system model that have shown that they can drive shareholder value creation in a public space. Danaher, UTC, Honeywell, go down the list of people that would attribute their success to their business system.
Right.
Why can't that be replicated in PE, and why can't that be replicated in lower middle market PE? And even in PE, you can point to some really good examples, like Vista Private Equity, who just buys software companies, has a business system.
Yeah.
And they have a playbook every time they buy a software company, and it's just like standard work.
Right.
And the returns that they generate are far greater than their peers or their comparisons. So I don't think that's rocket science. I think the challenge is convincing people who may have grown up in like the investment banking space, who've never worked in a company with a business system, have never manufactured anything, that these ideas can work in an area. And you're talking to like Harvard MBAs, Wharton MBAs, who are really successful and have a lot of money, and convincing them that they may have to do things different, right? So this whole be a humble leader, becomes challenging in a space where people have lots of dollars in their bank account.
Right.
Thankfully, like this group that I'm working with at Coltala, they were just avid learners, humble, wanted to learn. We taught problem solving, we taught strategy deployment. They're participating on Kaizen events. They're pushing the broom. They're down on their face. They're scraping the floor. They're doing everything that Larry Culp would say at Danaher we need to do as leaders. They're leading by example. So they're drinking the Kool-Aid, right? And the culture then is permeating the businesses that we buy, because they see that in order to be successful here as a holdco, a holding company, we need to act this way, which
Sure.
is the idea.
So if somebody listening is, let's say, looking for a new opportunity, and they're scouting out different jobs to be an internal lean facilitator, or let's say they've been an operations manager or a plant manager, they're looking for a new opportunity. If somebody finds a company and it says in the description, private equity owned, it seems like there's certain key questions of, as you've already touched on, Damon, looking at like, well, what type of private equity company is it? And are there other key questions that somebody should ask to sort of get beyond something that sounds good on the surface, like to make sure they're going into a situation where if they share the values of, lean leadership and, like you said, not Kaizening people out of jobs, and like what are some things people should look for, ask to make sure they're getting into a situation that meets their own purpose and values and way they would want to go about things?
Yeah. So let's say that this individual is has an appetite to learn through development and through participation and continuous improvement opportunities and these kinds of things. So if you're going into a situation that's a PE held business, you want to understand on a scale of 1 to 10 how active the PE firm is in driving value creation inside of the businesses that they acquire. So I like to just keep it really simple, 10 to 1. If Danaher were a 10 in terms of how involved they are in the companies that they own, they're kind of off the charts. Berkshire Hathaway is a 1. Like, we buy you and just leave you alone, and we expect you to write a letter once a quarter. That's it. And we don't go to your reviews. We don't question your strategy, and we invite you to Omaha to participate in. That's about it.
Right.
So if you have an appetite to learn a lot through portfolio value creation opportunities, and there isn't a group that does that because they're very hands off, you're going to find yourself, and you're not even going to maybe even know at times that you are in a different ownership situation because it doesn't land down to your level of the business, right?
Yeah.
So just understand how involved they are is one, and the fund versus long holding period is a second important question. So if you're coming into a business, my question would be, where are you at in the cycle? Right. So Are you 3 years in on a 5-year fund? Because then you got 2 years, and the amount of when you go to somebody with 2 years left on an investment and say, "Hey, Mark, I need $2 million of capex to buy a new piece of equipment to improve our on-time delivery." You're thinking about the exit multiple, and you're going to be like, "Can you hold it together for another?" Opinion? Yeah, we don't seem to have any money for new equipment, right? So you may be let down when you are coming at this from a long-term perspective, and they're viewing this as, I need to exit and maximize return.
Right.
So where are they at in the cycle is another one. And then the third one, I would say, help me understand, what is the value creation model? What is the standard work you use to drive improvement in the businesses that you own? And it kind of relates to question number one. So if they are hands-on, question number two is, well, walk me through the methodology you use to be hands-on.
Right.
And if it's only operations focused, meaning it's labor takeout, right, runaway, those, you can start to see like how comprehensive it is to know, are they really just focused on cost and cost takeout on short term, or are they more mission and margin and create a culture that's sustainable when we exit this business, and so on.
Right. Last time, we had a really good discussion. You shared some thoughts and strongly held opinions and views that lean people need to better understand financial statements and the business metrics and drivers of why are we doing things.
And I put myself in my group too, by the way.
Sure. Well, and I could understand that all better, even when it comes to hospitals and their financial statements. But is there more need for that financial savvy if you're going to be working for a private equity owned company, or at least willingness to develop that?
Yeah, it is. It is probably that on steroids, because again, think about where these people are coming from a career background standpoint. They were analysts, they were brokers, they were investment bankers, they were PE summer interns where they're looking at spreadsheets and doing pro forma models and things like that. So they are in the details of the P&L, and a lot of the questions are very financial oriented questions, where it's like, hey, talk to me about this variance here, or talk to me about why margin is eroding on this product line. Not unlike what you would expect in a well-run company, but there's more of a pronounced focus on that than, and oh, by the way, talk to me about the process you're improving that leads to that outcome. That part of the conversation doesn't happen as much as I'd like it to in private equity, right? So there is sort of a, kind of the needle pegs more to the financial side than the process and financial side. There isn't an equal mix all the time. So it becomes even more important to understand that stuff if you're working as a CI leader in a PE held business. If you want to make friends with the PE firm, be conversant in those sorts of topics and tie those topics to your continuous improvement priorities, so that people can see that you're aligned with their investment interest.
Sure. And so, I would invite people, I think it's really interesting to look at the Coltala Holdings website, at least, listed right now, 3 very different companies on the surface. Choice Health at Home, home health, hospice, things like that. Walker Air Plumbing and Electric in the DFW area, and then myfitnessstore.com. And you can go, and it's spelled out on the website, investment criteria. And I think it's interesting also, to look through and say, well, values. What are the values? What do you stand for? And I imagine for anybody looking at any PE firm, there's always that question to ask: how does that language really translate into reality?
Yeah. So I did a lot of diligence before I signed on to work with Coltala, and the 2 founders, Edward Crawford and Ralph Manning, those values you see on that page are what they espouse and believe and ooze every day in their interactions with people, not only in their personal lives, but in the business world. So their interests, their values were aligned and congruent with mine.
Yeah.
And if I were to add a fourth question, I know I probably should go back and rephrase my answer. It's like, understand what the values are for the PE firm. And I think you'd be hard pressed to, when you look at a lot of these PE firms, they actually don't articulate what those things are. Because they don't think of their company maybe as having a culture of values that are important in terms of how it drives the decision making. So that's a key piece for me of what attracted me to the business. And then each and every day you get to demonstrate whether or not those things are meaningful to you and the decisions that you take, and more importantly, how you act and behave. So.
Yeah. And, I think it's interesting just looking through this list. I mean, there are some that every firm might claim, like, being data driven, like who these days wouldn't say they're data driven, but then you see values here around blameless culture, humility, high levels of integrity and transparency. And those are things that might not be the values of every business leader or every PE firm. So it's interesting to see, just cherry picking from, a list of articulated values there. It's really interesting to see.
Yeah. It's not lip service too. Like, we start every meeting with one of those values and how we either lived or maybe didn't live that value, and how we could get better the next time. So there's like this constant reinforcement of the message inside of the work that you do, that otherwise just becomes words on a wall or on a website, in this case. So I think all values are aspirational. It's like, these are standards we try to aspire to hit. And on some days you'll be on your best behavior, and on others, but on balance, you hope that more days than not, the organization lives what it says is important. And it's up to leadership to hold people accountable to the standard and hold themselves personally responsible to adhere to the standard, more importantly.
Right. Yeah. Those PDSA cycles of life or of business, of identifying, if a gap is identified, the difference between ideal and where we are, let's acknowledge that, let's understand that better, let's move forward in ways that close that gap.
For sure. Yeah. And that takes humility, when you have to admit that maybe you had done something wrong in that example.
Yeah. Well, makes me think of a different podcast series I do, My Favorite Mistake. I'll hold up my mug here of, again, like, hey, we're all human. We all make mistakes, but learning from those mistakes or those gaps or short moments where we fall short, I think is really, really key.
I think I can make an 8-hour episode out of that.
You're not overstaying your welcome, but we could do an episode of that sometime too. Because I do appreciate when people, it's this combination of, it takes strength and humility to be willing to talk about mistakes or gaps. And I always appreciate that when we can have conversations like that.
Yeah. Larry Culp always said, humble but confident, the right balance of humility and confidence. So it's not like, humility isn't being deferential and being meek and sort of a wallflower.
Right.
I'm also confident in what I believe in, but I'm not, spiking the football on the 1-yard line.
Right. There's this balance, it would seem, of, let's say, for example, I have the confidence to try a new idea, but I have the humility to realize I might be wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
So one other thing I want to talk about here today, and thank you, Damon, for giving us an overview of, some examples of different ownership models: publicly held companies, privately held companies like KaiNexus. I'm wearing their shirt today, and then private equity owned companies. I think one really interesting model is when you have employee owned companies, and different models for that. And when you talk about the Ownership Works initiative, it seems like it's sort of in that category, and maybe there's some overlap in different dimensions here. But tell us about the Ownership Works initiative and what that means in terms of company culture and employee partnership.
Yeah. So it's not an ESOP, employee stock owned company, where 100% of the equity in the business is owned by the employees, and there's only a certain amount available and that kind of thing. So it's not that.
Mhm.
So I think so. Ownership Works. It's a nonprofit organization, and their charter or their mandate or their aspiration, if you will, is to engage the workforce inside of these companies. You have to make them feel like there's skin in the game. There's an ownership piece into the company, right? So you think about, let's say it's your business, and every morning you wake up, Mark, and of course you're motivated because you know that every activity that you engage in and every extra hour and minute of the day that you put in will come back to you in some sort of return, which you're going to be the benefactor of the financial return. So then those same founders get frustrated when they can't unlock that same level of engagement inside of people. And it's the answer I tell those people, it's like, it's your company. They're never going to get as motivated and excited about something they don't own.
Mhm.
You're treating them like employees, not owners.
Right.
That level of commitment will never be what you want it to be. So I think this Ownership Works is an attempt to align the incentives with the workforce so that there is something in it for them to want to engage in continuous improvement.
Mhm.
So KKR in particular, which is one of the PE firms that have signed on to Ownership Works, has designed the acquisitions to set aside a pool of equity for the employees of the businesses that they're acquiring.
Mm.
And it's not insignificant either. So you can actually go through and watch some of the videos where they filmed town hall meetings for like CHI Overhead Doors, which was one of their businesses that they just exited. And when Pete Stavros, who leads the KKR Industrials platform, is announcing the average paycheck that all these employees are getting, you see mouths literally like gaping open and falling on the floor, not realizing like how much value creation that they've realized through their full-scale adoption, engagement, and participation in all the value creation priorities that they've identified over the period that they've owned that business.
Mhm.
And it's an engaged workforce because they're making decisions like owners make decisions because, hey, if I could save some money here, that's more money that's going to, so they connect the activity to the reward, and they try to draw in the timing of that as much as possible. And then just remind people at these monthly town halls, like, here's what your investment's worth. Here's what your investment's worth. So that creates the engagement.
Yeah.
So the initiative Ownership Works is a recognition in our U.S. society that maybe capitalism hasn't benefited at all. And if you look at average CEO pay versus the hourly workforce or wage, it's like it's
a growing gap. Yes.
Done nothing but separate. So this is an attempt to try to rectify some of that. Not the only answer, obviously, but it's an attempt to that, and it's a pledge where not only PE firms but ever publicly or held corporations could sign on to and commit to make equity ownership part of how they engage their workforce by making them shareholders.
Yeah.
So,
because I mean, how often have we heard the phrase, we want employees to think like owners? Like, well, let's not make that a theoretical exercise.
Yeah. Pay me like an owner.
Yeah. Well, and so when you talk about setting aside that pool, or the website here, ownershipworks.org, encourage people to check it out. One of the case studies featured on the front page, I'm going to go watch the video after we're done here. It's about Ingersoll Rand. Like, that's a pretty old guard. Like, there's a long history, like, industrial
lean too, right?
Of what with lean?
I'm also doing lean too, by the way.
And it says here, the company made all 16,000 of its employees owner of the company. So is that initial equity pool? I don't know if gift is the right word. Is it given to the employees? as part of their compensation then? So maybe
Yeah.
gifts is the right word.
Yeah, I don't know the internal strings attached, whether or not there's a vesting period.
Sure.
I wouldn't be surprised if there was.
Right.
And then further, I think Ingersoll Rand in that example even did another grant of equity down the road after the initial one as well. And again, I don't know. Every organization is different, whether or not they vest 100% at allocation, or there's a vesting period over 3 years or 5 years, whatever it is. But
yeah, but as the website here, points to the need or the opportunity building wealth for all within the company, and some of the goals here. It talks about the power of shared ownership. Excuse me, creating economic opportunity, advancing racial equity. So there's that idea of wealth creation for all, of going across all dimensions of society and an employee base, and then enhancing employee engagement. Right. So a lot of this does sound very similar to what we might describe as lean, or concepts of respect for people and that engagement piece, and a culture where there's alignment, where we're part of the same team, as opposed to, like somebody mentioned the movie Office Space earlier. Like there's a famous scene there where Peter Gibbons is telling the consultants basically like, well, why should I put in any extra effort because I don't make any more money. I'm paraphrasing, but he says basically it's not that I'm lazy, it's a matter of motivation or something like that.
yeah,
We can create that alignment where when a company has an exit, everybody gets a windfall from that if they've contributed to the improvement and the value creation.
yeah. And I think there's just a lot of misunderstandings about the economy. So like the stock market is not the economy. So, and when people say, geez, you should be really happy because the stock is doing well, or the stock market's doing well. Well, only like 58% of the United States owns a share of stock in a company.
Wow.
So when we talk about that, we're really talking about, like little over half the company that's in that position and half that isn't. So that racial equity piece, won't solve all that equation, but it helps to. And you can even take that 58% and go, well, what's the 80-20 of that? And of all the shares held, what's the number of people that own the most stock? It's probably not you and I, right? It's Warren Buffett and others, that the ownership. So this is, again, to close the 42% gap on the other side. Ownership Works helps with that and aligns those interests and creates an avenue for wealth creation beyond just the annual merit increase or bonus, if you will.
Yeah. It's I think it's exciting to see leaders and organizations that are sort of bucking some past trends and moving things in this direction. I mean, I think of, let's say, Bob Emiliani and others who describe lean. I think Bob in particular describes this as progressive management, and that word progressive can be a loaded term, and don't mean for it to be political, but progressive in terms of like moving forward, doing things differently based on some values that go beyond just the bottom line or the wealth of a few. I think that's interesting as a way of how do we prevent people from giving up on capitalism? As you raise the point, capitalism has there are criticisms, but let's not let things get to a point where people are willing to throw that aside. And I say that as an MBA and somebody who's started a company, and I would call myself a capitalist. But I think you raised kind of the interesting phrase there earlier of conscious capitalism. How do we have mission and margin?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the key. And I think it's one of the secrets to unlocking real employee engagement. So you go to most organization, that is, if not the number one topic, it's in the top three. Like, how do we improve employee engagement? And I always turn back on them and talk about employee engagement is really a function of employee equity, meaning being treated fairly. So when not equity in the form of ownership, but just equity in
Right.
how you treat people.
Right. Equitable.
Yeah, exactly. So you walk into an organization and the first thing you notice in the parking lot is there's a reserved space for the president and his or her direct reports. That is a cut against being equitable. And when, the hourly workforce has had their pay frozen for years, yet we've seen executive compensation gone up, over that same period of time, is that equitable? And are we surprised at why people aren't engaged in totality, because they feel like they're being treated differently than maybe the select few that all the spoils go to? So it's hard to talk about engagement without also having a very frank, open, and candid conversation about compensation and reward and performance and all that kind of stuff. And it seems to be the conversation that most companies just don't want to have because it requires financial changes to be made. And somebody gives up something to give something, which we all don't want to do, right? The not in my backyard sort of mindset.
Right. But if we're creating value, it's no longer a zero-sum game. That we can all benefit from.
And it's a leap of faith. And I think, the more of these companies like Ingersoll Rand and CHI, where we see that the model works, the less of a leap of faith people will construe it as.
Well, Damon, I'm glad you're willing to have, the conversation about these topics and, different models, different ways of engaging and compensating people. So thank you for bringing the Ownership Works initiative to my attention. I'm glad we were able to explore that today. In addition to everything you've shared, very helpful, very educational when it comes to private equity and connections to lean. So Damon, really appreciate you being here again.
My pleasure, Mark. It's always a joy.
So it's been, again, Damon Baker. You can find Coltala Holdings at Coltala. Oh gosh, I lost it. My most recent mistake, not my Coltala.com. I don't know why I was thinking .org. It's ownershipworks.org. That's where I got those things confused. And again, you can also learn more at leanfocus.com. Damon Baker, we'll do this again sometime, maybe not again as soon, but certainly look forward to it. And thank you for everything you shared today.
Thanks, Mark. Take care.
You too.